An African mountain is about to squash Australia's economy. What can we do about it? And Coalition of the Willing rides again, -1. Coming up on this week's episode of the Citizens Report. Welcome to the Citizens Report. It's the 6th of March 2025. I'm Robert Barwick and I'm joined today by Citizens Party investigator and researcher Richard Bardon. Welcome, Richard.
Thanks, Robbie.
In this week's Citizens Report, we're going to talk about the self-inflicted pain we're about to go through because of a mine that's about to open in Africa, and we'll explain why it's self-inflicted. But we have a proposal that will save Australia if our political leaders are sensible. And we have to talk about what happened in the White House last Saturday morning Australia time, Friday US time, between Donald Trump and Vladimir Zelensky, because this is a subject the Citizens Party has been on top of forever, going back to the 90s, the whole issue of the relationship with Russia and how that turned into the Ukraine war, etc. So this was a very big deal and there's lots of consequences, and apparently Australia is going to single-handedly keep the war going. Anyway, that's coming up. Remember, first, you can help us get the message around. We do these shows not just to commentate, but to inform and activate people so that we can change the thing we're talking about. And one of the ways to do that is get the message out on social media because of the information that's going to be in the show. So you can please like the show, share it on social media, subscribe if you aren't already a subscriber to the channel, and remember to ring the bell icon for updates. There's a lot more updates nowadays because the election's on. Comment below. We really appreciate the feedback and I try to respond to the comments as we can. And also below is a donate button, which we really need your support for. Now that the election is on, it's very important that the Citizens Party makes an impact in that election, and we only get the support of the Australian people. The major parties have just rigged the game so that they get $5 a vote, because without being able to pay themselves through taxpayers' money, they wouldn't get any support. The Australian people support us, Australian citizens, but we need your financial support as well, especially in this election cycle. A few quick updates before we get into the main topics. One, election timing. There's always speculation this time of the term about when the election will be. When will the Prime Minister go to the Lodge? Everyone's familiar with that. It does appear this week there's a lot more substance to the idea there could be a April 12th election. So don't be surprised if on Sunday, it's Thursday today, if on Sunday Albanese does call an election for the 12th of April. We in the Citizens Party hope he doesn't. We hope he goes for at least a month later, full term, because the more time we have to get the message out, the bigger the impact we'll have. But whatever happens, we'll go like the clappers. I'm the Citizens Party's Senate candidate for Victoria, and my running mate is Sleeman Johanna. You've seen on our channel recently, I interviewed our very high-powered Senate candidate for New South Wales, Andy Schmulo. And Andy is someone that you can have absolute confidence if he was in Parliament, he would be kicking ass and taking names, as they say. He's there to break up the corrupt corporate monopolies and duopolies and oligopolies that are ruining people's lives by driving up the cost of living and rigging the system in their favour because of their hold over the major political parties. On the weekend, I'm taking off to WA, where we're going to launch the election campaign for our WA Senate team, Aisha Novakovic and Rex Riles, and we expect that to be a significant campaign as well. But we're running Senate slates in every state and territory except Canberra, which we feel bad about, but that's just life, unfortunately. So you will be able to vote for the Citizens Party everywhere in Australia, unless you live in the ACT, so sorry about that. And we've got a good coterie of House of Representatives candidates as well, in places like Riverina, which is the Wagga area, Richard Foley, Wollongong, Corwell here in Melbourne in the Broadmeadows area. So there's some pretty high-powered campaigns going on, and it's all on the campaign website that we can provide a link to. your support will be greatly appreciated. And look, if with the Citizens Party, one of the points that we're trying to make to people is if people support the Citizens Party because of the campaigns we've run, they know the impact we've had, everyone in Parliament knows who we are. We have forced them to address so many issues, but they don't take us seriously in electoral terms. However, if you want to get those politicians to realise they better start implementing the Citizens Party's solutions to the economic crisis, vote for us. Because if they notice that the vote is going to our party because of what we stand for, there'll be people inside those parties saying, well, if we don't want to keep losing votes to parties like the Citizens Party, we better start adopting their policies. That's how you can change Australia, even without winning an election. All right, so spread that word and let's get some results in this upcoming election. The other thing, our favourite subject, banks. This week we put out a press release because last week we started getting calls from Citizens Party supporters that they were paying $3 for withdrawing bank cash over the counter of the Commonwealth Bank. And remember, that wasn't supposed to happen. Last December, this was the big, rotten Christmas present that CBA announced, and there was such a big backlash to it, right, that the CBA said they're going to charge $3 to withdraw cash, that even Jim Chalmers called them up, and so the announcement was, okay, we've postponed that for 6 months.
Yeah, they were going to move 1 million customers across from one account type that they were getting rid of onto another one that just happens to charge fees for things the first one didn't.
That's right. And they said they'd be better off because the account fee itself went from $6 a month to $4 a month. So by moving 1 million customers over to this new sort of smart access account, then they'd be saving $2 a month in a fee. Except they get fees for things like withdrawing cash, which is $3 a pop. And if you're a pensioner, counting your pennies, and you have to go, even if you only go on pension day to withdraw cash, that's twice a month, and that's $6 just for withdrawing cash, which cancels out the saving of the fee on the account.
And then some.
And then some. I mean, this is what banks do. And so we'll do the token little, stomp our feet, get angry at the banks, but that's not the point. This is about the government. The problem here is that in Australia, banks do not fear the consequences of their actions. Professor Andy Shmulo went through that when I interviewed him in great detail, comparing it to South Africa, where the banks live in fear of nationalisation because most of the people in the South African Parliament hate them. The majority of people in the South African Parliament hate the banks, and so the banks are really worried that at any moment they might get nationalised, and so they behave themselves. Here in Australia, the banks have no fear of anything, and that won't change until the Citizens Party starts getting people elected, right? Because no one else is going to stand up to them. And there's a lot of people who are prepared to take up an issue against banks here or there. We are relentless because this question of corporations rigging the game in Australia starts with the banks. They are the big one. And unless we break their power, this economy will never function properly. So, have a look at the release we put out about that and keep flying the flag for the solution, which is the postal bank. Okay, that said, let's get into it. Now, I hope you're all intrigued by this headline. An African mountain is about to squash Australia's economy. What can we do about it? Now, Richard, we're going to talk about a looming disaster here, but part of this looming disaster is self-inflicted because we have indulged as a country for years in China bashing. But what's unique about China to Australia?
It's the old they need us more than we need them argument, which isn't true anyway, but we sell the bulk of the world's steel-making materials, iron ore from Western Australia and high-grade, the world's best coking coal from mostly from the Queensland Bowen Basin.
Yep.
And so China makes the most steel. We sell it to others as well, but we're the main supplier for them, like we are for everybody. And
that trade has been incredibly valuable.
It's the only thing that holds up our terms of trade at all.
Well, it is. It's more than a third. China is more than a third of our total trade. It is our biggest trading partner by far. we benefit from trade with China more than any other country in the world, probably with the exception of New Zealand. But in total terms, I think New Zealand's trade with China is 40%. We're just a bit below that. But the amount of money this country makes, Western Australia especially, no entity in the world, legal jurisdiction in the world makes more money out of China than Western Australia.
Because they know it.
And they know it, except as part of this era where because America decided to turn against China and drag us with it, all of our sycophantic politicians started lining up to bash China. You've even had West Australian politicians like Andrew Hastie lead the charge to bite the hand that feeds it, carrying on about China as a threat to Australia and calling for the economic decoupling of Australia from China. He did this in 2021. I couldn't believe it. I thought, how does a West Australian politician get away with saying, let's trash our economy? And that's why Mark McGowan, when he was in China, had a crack at Andrew Hastie, because we weren't the only ones who noticed. It was absolute lunacy. But this is what we've been indulging in. And so while we've been indulging in this biting the hand that feeds us, Richard, against our biggest and best trading partner, what's China been doing?
China's been doing what Australian politicians talk about doing. They've been diversifying their sources.
So tell us about this mountain in Africa.
I think it's technically two neighbouring mountains.
Is that right?
Simandou in Guinea in Western Africa. It's sub-Saharan Africa. There are two that currently untapped, soon to start producing ore, the largest untapped iron ore reserve in the world. The estimates range between 1.9 and 2.4 billion tonne of ore. And it's top grade magnetite. The absolute maximum, because of the chemical composition of magnetite, is a shade over 69% iron. This averages just over 65.
Right.
So there are deposits in WA that are that high purity, but they're being mined out. They're not going to last forever.
Yeah.
The figures that I found said the average in WA is 53% overall. And so, Simandou Rio Tinto did the exploration work on it in the late 1990s, but it's been held up by all of these various political changes, corruption scandals, lawfare by different companies trying to get their piece or hold on to it when they got caught doing something they shouldn't, and all of these things. And of course the usual political interference from America and Britain, mainly America. But yeah, it's coming online. They call it the Pilbara killer, not because it can eclipse the production of the Pilbara. Nobody can do that. It's an order of magnitude too small for that. But the fact that the Chinese are going to be basically buying all this ore, and a lot of them are the ones currently buying the high grade ore from the Pilbara, is just going to put potentially a lot of Western Australian mining operations they won't be able to just that ore going into that volume of ore, 60 million tonne of top grade ore going into the market every single year for the next however many years that is.
Yep.
Is going to depress the prices to a point where a lot of these guys won't be able to afford to operate, and then that's going to cause a big problem.
Now, I didn't get to ask you this earlier, but this has just occurred to me. A lot of people might have thought, well, given that it's in Guinea, which is much further away from China than we are, we might have felt a bit complacent about that. But is that extra distance that China has to transport it made up for the fact it's so much more pure and high quality? According
to various analysts in this field who, proven they know what they're talking about, the purity's high enough that you can run it through directly fed into electric arc furnaces that don't, without any pre-processing.
Which I understand were invented to recycle steel, and so that there's not much impurity in the steel they're recycling.
Yeah, well, there's known deliberate amounts of impurities, different alloys and so on.
Yeah, but it's not the same as dirt being chucked into a furnace, right?
Throwing rock
so
in
if this
furnace.
is pure enough, they can use this electric, and then it's a much more efficient process.
Yeah, and they can use gas as the reducing agent, pull the oxygen out of the iron and add a bit of carbon to make it into steel from iron. I mean, that's what steel is, which means they don't need the coking coal They don't need to import all that coking coal from Queensland or from anywhere else, but they're buying it from Queensland predominantly.
So your point was they call this the Pilbara killer, but in reality it's more the Queensland killer.
Well, yeah, I mean, David Llewellyn-Smith from Macro Business, that was his point that's what he calls it. It's a Queensland killer too, because if you go through the budget projections, they're counting on that trade keeping on happening, and within 3 years, potentially it just won't be happening at all anymore, or it's going to be reduced some amount, and their budget is, their margins on their budget is razor thin.
The Queensland state
government,
budget, yeah.
Queensland, because that's who collects the royalties,
yeah.
on the coal, and of course WA is not quite in that dire of a state, as you said, but it could be if mining companies start going bust, or they can't afford to pay their workers and keep their trains running.
And this is where I have to criticise Senator Matt Canavan, who I spend plenty of time on this show praising. He played a very important role in the bank branch closures inquiry, chairing that. But Matt is one of these politicians who likes indulging in China bashing. And I remember in the 2019 election, Matt led the counterattack against the Greens because Senator Bob Brown led a convoy through the coal mine areas of Queensland, right? Advocating they'd be shut down. Of course, that was received really, really well, and the locals just told him to get lost. And Matt was indulging in that. But with all the China bashing that Matt Canavan and the Nationals have been doing as well, I'm thinking, well, Matt, who are you selling your coking coal to? You're selling it to China, right? And if China's going to why would China keep doing business with an unfriendly country if it finds these alternatives? Yeah. So this is self-inflicted. We've done this to ourselves.
And if you think about it, it's entirely self-inflicted because Australian governments deliberately shut down an offshore production of steel in the 80s and 90s in the first place. Otherwise, we wouldn't have been depending on China or Japan before that for steel.
I remember years ago I spoke to a mathematics professor at Melbourne University who's a steel or a metals expert as well because of his mathematical skills. And he made the point to me that we shut down the BHP Steelworks in Newcastle in 2000 just before world steel demand soared through the stratosphere. That's what geniuses we are. Because our BHP, which was primarily a steel company, decided it was just going to be a resources company.
Yeah, and of course, the Whyalla operation, the only fully integrated steel production facility left in Australia, well, BHP built that and built their own ships next door to cart their stuff around the country and even internationally. They built their own shipping fleet with their own steel. And we don't do any of that anymore.
So, however, because we are visionaries and we're not just here to push people's buttons and make them worried about the future, there's a solution, and it's an obvious one we've been involved in pushing for a while, but it occurred to you immediately at looking at this problem. Map it out for us. Yeah,
so the efficiency gain in these electric arc furnaces, you're still shipping ore halfway, not quite halfway around the world. Well, we've got the coal there, and we've got in Queensland, we've got the iron ore over there, and so this proposal's been floating around in various forms since I think the 1970s, mainly pushed by the same guy, Shane Condon, who you've interviewed, or Glenn Isherwood interviewed on our interview series here, called the iron boomerang. It's called boomerang because it goes one way and it comes back again. You have a double track railway, you bring iron from the Pilbara to Queensland and you take coal back again, and the trains just run each way all day, every day, and you make 22 million tonne at each end of primary steel, first stage raw steel.
Slab steel.
Slab, rod and coil, in whatever amounts you need for different things you want to make or your customers want. And you eliminate the inefficiencies of carting ore that is generally about 60% iron and 40% waste material, slag, and currently the coal as well, whether or not people go to electric arc furnaces, which can be run on coal as well, depending on the type. But yeah, you eliminate all that inefficiency, you've more than made up for the gain. You've more than surpassed the gain from being able to use these electric arc furnaces and not having to use the coal. just by removing all of that physical effort and the energy and expense required to send giant ships across the ocean and bring them back empty and then bring the steel back on other ships.
And Shane Condon's idea is that you would invite countries, the steelmaking countries, to build these steel mills at either end.
Yeah.
That can do this.
And they were all lining up for it, and all it needed was government approval and a bit of rezoning and the acquisition of the railway corridor, and they won't come at it. Well, here's your opportunity, guys. You've got to do something. You're going to watch the two mainstay industries of our country go belly up because you annoyed our customer enough that they invested in this other thing because they can't rely on us anymore.
Yeah, exactly. And now, and on top of that, we could also do things that increase Australia's steel consumption, namely things like high-speed rail, which we've been talking about forever and never done. China has built, this year China reaches 50,000 kilometres of high-speed rail, built using steel made from Australian iron ore, and we haven't laid 1 centimetre of it, right? And we've been talking about it forever, and this is symbolic of the disappointing Albanese administration, because Albanese came to office as the infrastructure prime minister. He had been infrastructure minister forever. He set up the High Speed Rail Authority in June 2023. They were given $500 million to scope out Newcastle to Sydney. And if that's not a viable high-speed rail track in Australia, nothing is. $500 million. Of that $500 million, so far they've only spent $80 million on an unfinished business case. These guys just don't know how to get their act together. And meanwhile, China is breaking all sorts of records, laying over 2 kilometres of high-speed rail track a day, right, which is record-breaking stuff.
And now they're building magnetically levitated super high-speed trunk lines that run at 600 kilometres an hour instead of 300 and something.
Yeah.
And if you put them in a semi-evacuated tunnel, they run at nearly 1,000. And you know, we've been advocating this stuff here all along. We could have been doing all this stuff.
We could start off with
and selling steel to China.
Exactly.
Because we've got decades and decades and decades worth of the stuff, but we don't use it.
So, and of course it would save Whyalla, right? With all this kerfuffle going on with Whyalla, of course you still need to do things like bring electricity and gas prices down, but that's the story. We've talked about that before. So all this requires, Richard, is national vision and investment, and that's why, how would we possibly pay for this? Well, we're a country that actually boasts a very large superannuation pool, $3 trillion. We're at
4.1 now, altogether.
$4.1 trillion. Is anyone talking about using superannuation to invest in Australia? We've got a massive foreign debt. It came up in a discussion last night, so I looked it up. Our gross foreign debt is now $2.5 trillion, around $2.5 trillion, which is closing in on 100% GDP, gross foreign debt. Net foreign debt is $1.2 trillion. What are we doing with this $3 trillion super pool? Well, I'm going to play a video because right now our government is one of the governments around the world that's on Operation Suck Up to Donald Trump, because Donald Trump is about to put tariffs on Australian aluminium, and probably steel. And steel, all right, based on some disinformation actually by another anti-China nutcase named Peter Navarro, who's actually trying to say, what does he say? China is controlling our
he says
industry.
China. He says Australian aluminium companies are majority owned and controlled by China when they're actually majority owned and controlled by American interests.
Yep.
One of them is actually American.
Yeah, Alcoa.
And he says that Australia's government is heavily subsidising and dumping aluminium in America to destroy their industry because China told us to. It's like this guy never even opens a newspaper or what, or he's listening to that little voice in his head that he made up.
So this is the advisor. So this is the advisor Trump's listening to when he's about to put tariffs on us. So we sent Jim Chalmers, Kevin Rudd, and someone else to go and suck up to the White House.
Don Farrell,
Farrell,
trade minister.
And they made this video to take with them. Have a look.
Around 40 years ago, Australia established a national retirement system called superannuation.
The Americans were shown a short video explaining what super actually is.
Super for us.
And super for the US. Let's partner
and supercharge
America together.
I think the impression has been incredibly positive.
So there you go, Richard. Our super is going to make America great again.
I wish I was surprised that they would come up with something like this. Remember when they set up compulsory superannuation contributions in the 80s and 90s, this is what they promised it would be used for in Australia, and it never was. It never was intended to be. They lied from the get-go. But this is how it was advertised for us, and now we're going to use it.
We used to run.
In America.
We've run the ad here before that Bob Hawke did in 1990. It's a national, and he said it's a national savings scheme. It'd be good for you and good for the country. It'll allow us to invest in economic development here without borrowing from overseas. That's what he said, and it hasn't happened. And here now we actually need it if we're going to not be squashed by this African mountain. And what are they going to do about it? Well, elect the Citizens Party, and we'll make sure something gets done about it. Okay, Richard, let's move on. I just looked at the clock. We're running a bit short of time here. Coalition of the Willing rides again, -1. I can't believe I had to write those words again. Coalition of the Willing, but we'll get to that. So the biggest story this week is clearly what we woke up to on Saturday morning, Donald Trump's showdown with Volodymyr Zelensky in the Oval Office. Now, this is actually very significant and has huge ramifications, but the way it's been reported in the media is completely arse backwards. And a lot of it's because of the way people view Donald Trump, right? He's easy to demonise. And I know, Richard, you would be sympathetic with people who think Donald Trump's a blowhard idiot. So might misunderstand what's happened.
Yeah, I mean, he's a blowhard, definitely. An idiot, not so much. But he plays the fool when it suits him. He lies as fluently as he breathes. Everybody knows this. But, so yeah, it's important to look at what they're actually doing and not just what they say they do or what Trump says he wants to do.
So the point we made in the alert this week, pro-war nations trapped in self-delusion, is that don't let the media turn this into the character of Donald Trump. I mean, the spat with Zelensky was the character of Donald Trump, that's for sure. But it's what's behind that that's quite crucial. And this is where, if you have the time and you've got nothing else to do, stay on this channel and go back to, we'll just go back to 2014, actually, and watch every show from 2014 onwards and look at the analysis we've done on the Ukraine situation ever since. We have covered this in great detail. We've been ahead of the game of the media in Australia. So the point we want to make here is what Trump is doing right now is not just on a whim. It's not just him being someone that's hard to please. He actually represents a faction of Americans who know this war should never have started and that it must end. And this faction includes some very, if you knew these people and you have a caricature of Americans as just, you know, the loud, obnoxious Americans, you would actually change it if you met these people. People like George Kennan. George Kennan was America's top Soviet expert from the beginning of the Cold War, who, he wrote the memo from Moscow or something.
The Long Telegram?
The Long Telegram, which kind of started the Cold War in a sense, saying this is what the Soviets are doing, way back in the 40s. He wrote that. I watched a speech by Robert McNamara, the US Defence Secretary during the Vietnam War that he made in the 90s. Someone shared it with me the other day. And in the middle of that speech, unexpectedly, he paid tribute to George Kennan about how George Kennan was so much an expert on the Soviet Union that he was able to help the Kennedy and Johnson administrations navigate the Cold War without it coming to an actual war, right? And he gave him enormous tribute. And then in the 90s, George Kennan is one of the loudest voices in America against the expansion of NATO. He warned what would happen if NATO expanded. And what happened is what has happened, right? And you can't just say, dismiss him in the same category as Trump. No, these are real experts who knew what America was doing. Jack Matlock is the last US ambassador to the Soviet Union, I think he was, Jack Matlock, right? Before it became broke up into component parts. He's been, to this day, George Kennan's passed away, of course. Jack Matlock, to this day, is a very strong voice against what America's policy has been that caused this war. Chaz Freeman, former US ambassador to Saudi Arabia and some other places. He was Nixon's translator when Nixon went to China.
In the early 70s.
The famous John Mearsheimer, which probably is a name most people would probably know by now, but you can't say that Mearsheimer didn't get this 100% right.
Yeah. The old brutal realist.
The brutal
as he calls
realist
himself.
He said in 2016, if America's leading Ukraine down the primrose path and Ukraine is going to get wrecked. That's the quote from John Mearsheimer. He warned that in 2016. That's exactly what's happened. And then another name is Jeffrey Sachs. And Jeffrey Sachs is a name people might recognise. And the interesting thing about Jeffrey Sachs is a lot of the other people have been in government. Mearsheimer and Sachs have been in academia. But Sachs's work in international development means he got to know these governments intimately over the decades. And so he had that perspective when he's listening to American propaganda trying to turn Russia into the ogre of the world, saying, you guys have no idea what you're talking about. All they need is certain assurances, be treated reasonably and it'll be fine. But of course, America had the neocon faction in America had no intention of doing that. Some Australians, Malcolm Fraser, absolutely on the same page, warned the same thing. Paul Keating, who is still alive, in 1997, warned about the expansion of NATO. These older generation guys knew what would happen. They must be listened to, and instead they all get dismissed. So don't fall for this thing that this is about Trump's character or whatever, and this is just a whim of Trump. Richard, the Ukraine war started in the White House, so it makes sense that it ends in the White House. except Zelensky doesn't get it. Now, I wish we had more time to provide some video evidence of this, but we've covered this so much over the years, it's not funny. But and you probably know some of these details better than me. But funnily enough, Zelensky, who's this comedian actor, and there's a whole question there about how the whole Zelensky operation happened. But he gets elected. That was 2017, I think. He got elected. The first thing he did is he went to eastern Ukraine, and he actually. You can see the video footage of him confronting the Azov battalion and asking them to stop the bombing of eastern Ukraine. And they laughed at him. And they threatened him for telling them. As the new president, they actually threatened him. So who's the Azov battalion?
Yeah. Literally the sons and grandsons of the Nazi collaborators of World War II.
Literally.
Swastika tattoos and everything.
Literally. Zelensky knows that.
Yeah,
right?
Everybody knows that. The Western media used to report that until it suddenly became politically incorrect because we decided to support them.
By the way, this military confrontation in eastern Ukraine that started in 2014 after America ran a coup in Ukraine and installed their own government there, was so one-sided that by 2022, the Organisation for Security and Cooperation in Europe, the OSCE, not a Russian organisation, their figures of the death toll were 14,000 dead from 2014 to 2022. 80% of those were on the Russian-speaking side.
Yeah, civilians mainly.
Yeah, this was Poroshenko, and if we were running propaganda against Gaddafi or Saddam Hussein or Vladimir Putin, we'd be saying Putin's killing his own people, Assad's killing his own people. This was Poroshenko and Zelensky killing their own people. Right? It was the Western Ukrainians bombing the hell out of Eastern Ukraine, right? The OSCE figures actually show that. So he gets laughed at. More importantly, he gets threatened by these actual murderous Nazi killers, and he capitulates. And from that moment, Zelensky became the propaganda figurehead of this Anglo-American war. And that's all he is now. He doesn't have a democratic mandate. His term expired last year.
Yeah, May or something last year.
This is the other thing the Trump administration's talking about, and he's totally propped up by the Americans and the Brits, except Trump's just pulled out the props. What happened then is we're not going to keep this going, and what's laughable is what's happened as a reaction to that. The Brits have showed their hand because they have played such an important role in this whole Ukraine operation from the get-go. The British have a bee in their bonnet about the Russians going back literally centuries, right? The hatred of Russia by the British for imperial reasons goes back centuries. So they have, straight after World War II, which the Russians won for the world by defeating the Nazis, Churchill said to Truman, let's now go and kill the Russians, right? While they've lost 27 million people defeating the Nazis, now they're weak and vulnerable. Let's go kill them. So the Russians clearly know what the British think of them. So the Brits have said, well, we're going to try and take the leading role here in keeping Zelensky afloat. And from that, it's just become increasingly ridiculous. So Zelensky goes back to Europe via London. Starmer, I saw the footage of Starmer welcoming him at number 10, and there was this large crowd of supporters showering him with absolute adulation. And all I could think was Potemkin Village, right?
Well, people might not realise that Downing Street is closed off and you have to be let in there.
Yeah, you do.
This is staged.
Yeah, absolutely staged. Then Zelensky was given the high honour of a personal audience with King Charles. I mean, what more could you ask for, right? That's how you fate people. Then Starmer announced a $2.7 billion loan. Now, when I saw that, how does that compare with the amount of money that America said it's not going to keep funding anymore? What's it been, $200 billion?
Oh, at least.
Right? $200 billion in 3 years, which hasn't been enough to help Ukraine win the war. And the Brits are going to keep it going with $2.7 billion. But then the part that really got me is he actually also announced a new coalition of the willing. Will be the people who keep supporting Ukraine, a coalition of the willing. And remember, that was the name for what we called the joke of a war. Well, the war wasn't a joke, but the joke of the international coalition that was prepared to go into Iraq.
The international community, whatever they want to call it. And it was just America, NATO, and some hangers-on like Australia.
Like Australia, New Zealand didn't go.
Ukraine did.
Ukraine did, that's right.
They sent, I think it was 16,000
Ukraine
troops.
was in the actual coalition of the willing.
Yeah.
So US, Australia, Ukraine, and a few Pacific islands or something, that was the coalition of the willing. It was an utter joke. And it committed what is still now the war crime of the 21st century. And this buffoon, this clown, Starmer, has revived that idea as, we're going to keep the Ukraine war going. Problem is, if it doesn't include America, right, it's just a joke from beginning to end. But who wants in?
The usual suspect.
The usual suspect. And this is so bizarre, even his opponent isn't interested. Anthony Albanese wants Australia in on the action.
Yep.
He actually went out of his way to deliberately say Australia could send troops to Ukraine as part of, he called it part of some kind of peacekeeping operation. Even Peter Dutton said, no, not interested. We are literally on the other side of the world. It has zero interest to Australia at all.
Well, and we can't do it practically anyway.
Yep.
As the military just point blank refused in 2014 when Tony Abbott wanted to send a regiment over there after MH17 was shot down.
Yep.
And they just said, look, that would require the commitment of the entire strength of our armed forces to sustain a deployment in Ukraine. And we still wouldn't be able to do anything there if anyone decided to make an issue of us being there. So it's a complete and utter... It'd be hilarious if it weren't so dangerous.
But then here's why it's happening. This is what people need to understand. Why are these governments, like Australia's, like the European governments, etc., even though the country that is the only reason this war is happening, America, is talking about pulling the rug out from under it. Why are we sticking with it? Well, partly it's because we're so invested in the propaganda. Nobody, to accept this war should end without Ukraine winning, which it never will, is to accept that Zelensky should have taken the deal he was offered before it started. And what the deal was essentially this: declare neutrality.
Yep.
You'll never join NATO. That's all Russia wanted. That this buffer state called Ukraine would never join NATO and be a neutral country.
Yeah. And it's not as though there's no precedent for that. Look up Austria. We don't have time to get into it. But then 2 months into the war, when with Russian forces, what was it? It was only a few miles, relatively speaking, away from Kiev.
Yeah.
And so they signed a preliminary peace agreement. The Russians withdrew as an act of goodwill from those areas. And what did the Ukrainians and their backers do? Well, Boris Johnson went over and said, no, don't sign that. We'll keep you fighting. And they staged an atrocity in a town called Bucha that people might remember to demonise the Russians some more, and escalated the war when they had a peace agreement that was a lot better deal than anything they could possibly get now.
A million times better.
Even if Trump cut all of the support today, which he hasn't yet, but they're talking about, they've reopened diplomatic channels preliminary to that. So we still, like I said, we still need to see the concretes that actually come out of this. But everyone's, including Australia, is freaking out about just the prospect of that war winding down.
And normal relations
and
with Russia.
normalising relations with Russia.
By the way, if you don't believe Bucha was a staged massacre, just follow what the Russians are saying. The Russians have one question on the table that no one on the Ukrainian side will answer. The Russians have asked, what are the names of the people killed in the Bucha massacre? If this was the Bendigo massacre, every name would be known. Their whole history would be known. Nobody knows the names of the people supposedly killed by the Russians in the Bucha massacre. They haven't been made public. And this is what it was the timing that's the most important thing. And so the biggest issue with that, with Zelensky turning down that deal, is who knows how many dead later? 1 million people? 1 million dead later?
Possibly.
And what happens in these wars is because you go through this phase where the idiots who are determining if the war is going to continue saying, we have to make sure the dead haven't died in vain.
Yeah, it's
We're
called,
going to win.
in economic terms, which I don't like to use in this when you're talking about human lives, but it's the same idea. They call it the sunk cost fallacy.
Sunk cost fallacy.
Otherwise known simply as throwing good money, or in this case, men after bad.
Yep.
Right? That's gone. You lost. Deal with it. Right?
Yep.
This is what happens. And the stupidest thing I've ever heard: people saying, "Oh, well, the war could end tomorrow if Russia just stopped, if Russia withdrew." Why isn't anyone demanding that? What do you think they've all been demanding for the last 3 years? It didn't work. Now you've got to deal with reality as it is, not as you'd like it to be. And these people are so used to doing all of this stuff and getting their way and being the unipolar, which, to Marco Rubio's credit, words I never thought I would say, he publicly acknowledged
that's where we're at.
that is now the case with Russia. We can't pretend that we have everything over Russia. Now, unfortunately, they're redeploying more resources to the Pacific, which we'll no doubt talk more about. So this is not like some world peace thing, but at least the prospects have reduced that we're all likely to get vaporized next Tuesday. So, give them that much credit.
Well, that's right. And so what you're seeing with these leaders in Europe and, Elbow is they don't want to acknowledge the truth that they were lying about for 3 years, right? And they're prepared to double down. And in Elbow's case and the rest of the case, including the fact that they were happy to give platforms to actual Nazis. Last year, I worked my butt off with members of the Ukrainian community to try and get attention to the fact that we in Victoria, this Victorian government gave an actual Nazi a state funeral, an actual Nazi, a guy who has spent his whole career glorifying these people who were the perpetrators of atrocities against the Jews and Poles and Gypsies in World War II in Ukraine, right? To this day, who glorify these people, using the Nazi slogan, Slava Ukraini, right?
Yeah, well, Ukrainian fascist Nazi allies, and the armed wing of that organisation participated in the coup in 2014 and the subsequent civil war.
And Albanese went to Kiev with this guy, this Australian guy, Stefan Romanev, before he died of a heart attack, and he was given a state funeral here. It was just absolutely bizarre, right? And right now, because Gaza's the issue, all these same politicians are jumping up and down about anti-Semitism, like it's this deep-seated hatred of Jews has just bubbled to the surface, and it's got nothing to do with Gaza and the atrocities over there. It's so bad. Yet, on this front, on the Ukraine front, they've given a platform to actual Nazis. That's how much they bought into the propaganda. And now that there's the slightest prospect that you may have a turn towards ending this war, no, can't do it. Doesn't matter how many more people die.
Yeah. I mean, if we could normalise relations with Japan within 10 years of World War II, that actually attacked us, and all the things that everybody knows about.
That's true.
What is a war literally half a world away that never had anything to do with us in the first place except we build into it? I'm glad you said that, Richard. My grandfather fought on the Kokoda track. He died when my mum was 6. I never met him. But my mother
went to her grave in 2015 despising the Japanese her whole life. Didn't matter that they were allies of Australia now, etc. Right? Because of what we experienced in World War II with the Japanese, yet we were able to do a peace arrangement with them and treat them as friends and let them come in as investors and things like that.
And sell them wheat and sell them iron and all the rest of it.
Yeah. So if we can do that, we can do it with other countries. One last point I want to make, because this just shows you the hypocrisy of the people who want to keep the war going. The European Union, of course, the $2.7 billion from the Brits ain't going to be enough, but the European Union has actually announced a very large war chest of hundreds of billions of dollars, right? And the way that's going to come from a surge in spending on weapons, cha-ching for the military-industrial complex. But the way they're going to do it is, get this, they're going to allow the member states of the European Union to ignore a fiscal rule using what they call an escape clause. And this is a fiscal rule that limits how much they can borrow as nations.
And it's one of the tenets of the EU agreement that the things you sign up to join the EU.
Yeah. So after the global financial crisis in 2008, within a couple of years, that had become the European debt crisis. And the centre of it was Greece, of course, but also Italy and Spain and these countries, the southern European countries. And they were crushed by the EU because of this rule. The EU would not let them breach this rule that limited their borrowing capacity, even though all their pensioners were starving and it was just hell on earth in those countries.
Borrowing and spending.
They enforced this rule. But to keep a war going that's killing millions, you can breach the rule. You can ignore the rule. Right? These are not the good guys. Plus, I saw the comedian Jon Stewart do this stupid piece where he actually talked about Europe in the context of, representing democratic values. The last thing people need to know about Europe, the most important thing people know about Europe, the EU, is there's nothing democratic about it. The people who are elected in the European Parliament have no power, and the people who have the power in the European Commission are not elected. And they're the ones that are making up these rules and doing, it's nothing democratic about Europe. So get off our sanctimonious high horse, which is built on a tissue of lies, and actually welcome that there may be an end to a horrible war in a very chaotic, typical Trumpian way. If it actually happens, as Richard has cautioned, because there's all sorts of forces being brought to bear to stop it.
There's way too many moving parts in all of this for us to cover on this show.
Including inside the Trump administration itself, right? So you've got to be careful about that. But the reaction, what we're talking about, is bananas. Especially, they gave it away by calling it the coalition of the willing. All right, enough of that. We've run out of time. So thanks, Richard, for joining us today. And if you want to read Richard's article on the mountain that's going to squash Australia, you can call in and get a copy on the Australian Alert Service, but we'll also have it on our website. And if you get a copy of the Alert Service, you should subscribe to it, because all our analysis is in there. Like I said, please make a donation to the Citizens Party to help our campaigns at the moment. And thanks for tuning in. Remember to tune in next week for more of the Citizens Report.
Authorised by Robert Barwick, Citizens Party, Melbourne.